I'll start introducing the title of this. It's kind of, I'm very tongue-in-cheek with myself here. It's called Boundaries in Our Promised Land. And we have this opening quote, people that I know that people are still getting the papers, and that's okay. This opening quote is, first of all, don't give up on this relationship. And so before I jump into the text sheet, really I'll talk about what I'm talking about boundaries. I've done a lot of pastoral counseling, and also last year I did a lot of teaching. So when I think about boundaries, I think about boundaries in relationship. I don't know if any of you are counselors or social workers or things like that, but boundaries in relationship, I associate those two words very much. And then also teaching in a classroom, I guess it's the trendy thing to do to not have rules, but instead to have boundaries. Like the boundary is you don't use your phone in class, which sounds like a rule, but so I've got a lot of connotations with the word boundaries, but mostly we're going to be talking about actual boundaries, like drawing the line between this and that, and specifically between one area of land and another. So Israel Nitzan, Acting Consul General, Consulate General of Israel in New York. I had the privilege of joining by Zoom a rabbinical assembly session led by him, and it was is everything fine? Okay, everything's fine. Okay, no boundaries, we love that. Or maybe not. Anyways, maybe we will, maybe we won't, we'll get into that. But the session was supposed to be about and it really was about the terrorist situation that's unfortunately happening around Jenin in our Holy Land. And even though there's a lot of political things going on besides just that, he was able to kind of, get the conversation centered around that. And at the very end of the session, one of the other facilitators was commenting on all the hard questions that were asked. And a lot of my colleagues asked a lot of very hard questions. And he responded to that by saying that he appreciates that we're all here. And the facilitator of the session was saying there were 40 rabbis gathered on Zoom, taking time out of all of our, completely free schedules, of course, to prioritize this conversation. And in thanking us for being there, what he said was, first of all, don't give up on this relationship. As if it were an option really to give up on a relationship with Israel. And it really stuck out to me that for him, he was aware that it could be an option to give up on that relationship. For me, it's not an option. For us in this community, I know it's not an option. But that was striking to me that people would be unwilling, that even rabbis might be unwilling to show up for this relationship. But then I read this week's Parsha, and I was reminded that it's actually not a new thing at all to not want to show up for our Holy Land, which is kind of crazy. So let's read from Bamidbar's chapter 32, verses 1 through 6 here. I'll read in the English. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. Noting that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were a region suitable for cattle, the Gadite and Reubenite leaders came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains in the community and said, Ataroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Eliah, Sibam, Nebo, and Beon, the land that God has conquered for the community of Israel is cattle country, and your servants have cattle. It would be a favor to us, they continued, if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. So we the Jewish people have not even entered the Holy Land for the first time yet, and already there are these people that are like, we don't really want to live there. We'd rather live in this other place because it's a better place to live. And so if you would like to read further what Moses has to say, I invite you to find those verses in the Eitz Chaim. But Moses has some choice words. I'll just start us off and say, Moses replied to the Gadites and the Reubenites, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? So you want us to do all of this work of conquering the Holy Land, of going to war, so you can have a nice place for your cattle that you think is better? That's a ridiculous idea, says Moses. Eventually they work out a plan, they work out a deal. But it was striking to me that even before we, the Jewish people, enter the Holy Land, we have some of us that are like, nah, I'd rather not. I'd rather give up on this. And that just shows how important it is to commit to our relationship to this place, because it's our homeland, it's our promised land. So I want to move now to another thing that I found this week about boundaries, about borders, that I found striking. So I've mentioned to a few of you, and so I'll tell all of us, that I have been busy cleaning out the rabbi's study. I am learning about myself that I am a very thorough cleaner. I am finding all sorts of interesting things. I found Hebrew Scrabble, which we will all hopefully enjoy tomorrow at game night. That was a great find. And I found the APAC Annual Rabbinic Resource Guide from 5783, which is this current year. And I saw this map, and I found it very striking for several different reasons. So just reading Israel's narrow waistband, at its narrowest point, Israel is only 9 miles wide from the Mediterranean Sea to the West Bank, with half its population and infrastructure in a 60-mile strip along the coastline. I think probably many of us already know this. It's like, this is not new information. But one of the things that I appreciate about AIPAC is they're providing education to people who are Americans, who are politicians, that some of them have never traveled internationally. Some of them don't have passports. When I learned that AIPAC bought or arranged for passports for politicians to travel to Israel who had never traveled internationally and didn't have a passport, I was like, wow, this is a whole other level of this work that I wasn't aware of. So bringing it back to the map for a moment, so these are boundaries drawn in a particular way. Obviously, every map of our Holy Land is very much political, and I think it's striking that AIPAC makes this point about Israel's borders and says that, okay, here's this area, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which is different, at least right now, than the land of Israel, or is it? Conversation to follow. I'll see you at Kiddush. So there's that. But this map comes from AIPAC, and I found it very striking. So let's go to the next side of the sheet, because the question of what are the borders of our Holy Land, we are still working to answer that on an international level, and I think that it's interesting that in our Torah portion this week, it actually gives us what the borders of our Holy Land are. But can we understand exactly what it means? So we'll read through this, and I invite you to follow along with these maps in the back of the Eitz Chaim. I don't know if people know, maybe people are already familiar with these maps in the back. Their pages aren't actually numbered, which is interesting. It's 1512, and then the next one here is 1513. But there are a couple of pages if you want to follow along. So I tried to do this myself. I was not particularly successful at reading these verses and finding these places. I found myself very confused. Maybe people who are better at maps than I am want to try this one on the back page of this, but I think that the one that's labeled, what's it labeled? The land of Canaan, Abraham to Moses, that might be our best bet. I did a tiny little bit of Googling of what maps people have created in response to these verses. Oh wow, that was a rabbit hole that I could have gone very far down, and I was like, there were some things that kind of made sense to me, some things that were like, wow, I don't know where you got this from, but I invite you after Shabbat to explore that on your own if you're interested. And so let's just read this and see. And also another note that as we read it, we'll see that the boundaries that are defined in our text of the Torah, in our Torah portion this week, are not the same as the boundaries that we know as the boundaries that are currently the boundaries of our Holy Land. So here we go. God spoke to Moses saying, "Instruct the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as your portion, the land of Canaan with its various boundaries." Okay, so we've got the southern sector. Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom. Your southern boundary shall start on the east from the tip of the Dead Sea. And so this stuck out to me right away. It was like, wait a second, what about Eilat? Like, isn't that further down, or what's going on, or am I confused, or I don't know. But so, okay, here we go. Your boundary shall then turn to pass south of the ascent of Akrabim and continue to Zin, and its limit shall be south of Kadesh Barnea, reaching Hazar Adar and continuing to Azmon. From Azmon, the boundary shall turn toward the Wadi of Egypt and terminate at the sea. And I'm okay. By the end, now I'm back on board where the southern boundary ends at the sea. I think I'm here. Okay. For the western boundary, you shall have the coast of the Great Sea. That shall serve as your western boundary. I'm like, okay, I can follow this. Being from California, we also have a western boundary at the sea. I was like, this is familiar to me. This is great. Okay. And now we have the northern boundary, getting a little bit more confusing, at least for me again. Draw a line from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor, draw a line to Lebo Hamath, and let the boundary reach Zedad. The boundary shall then run to Ziphron and terminate at Hazar Enan. That shall be your northern boundary. Now we have the northern boundary. The eastern boundary, again, a little bit clearer. And so this is the part that if you flip back to the first side, the Reubenites and the Gadites, they wanted to be east of this eastern boundary. So for your eastern boundary, you shall draw a line from Hazar Enan to Shepham. From Shepham, the boundary shall descend to Riblah on the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary shall continue downward and abut on the eastern slopes of the Sea of Kinneret. The boundary shall then descend along the Jordan and terminate at the Dead Sea. And that shall be your land as defined by its boundaries on all sides. So clear as mud? I'm not sure. I think that if the illustrious scholars that came up with this book had known exactly what this means, I think they probably would have drawn it in one of the maps. And I just find it striking that this is something that, on the one hand, the boundaries are clear to define and necessary to define. If we look at the graphic on the front side, we might agree and disagree with certain ways the boundaries are drawn, but they're drawn somewhere. And in our text, in our Eitz Chaim, we don't really know exactly where these places are. And so I think that I'm intrigued by the scholarship and the ongoing quest to understand both what the Torah is saying and what's going on in our day-to-day lives, and the importance of having this space that is ours and being in relationship with it. And even though it is confusing, even though it's difficult, even though even rabbis have difficult questions to ask, and we all have difficult questions to ask, the most important part is to be in relationship with Israel, to love Israel, to protect Israel, and to work for security in Israel. Because if we don't have security and safety in our holy land, we can't have any other conversation. So safety and security always has to be, at least for me, the most important piece. So that's our learning for today. And I look forward to Kiddush conversation about it. If you have any questions, or if you can't stay for Kiddush, you're welcome to email me. My email address is on the front side of the sheet, and we will continue with Chatzi Kaddish.